All right. All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Jim, and this is Nikki.
Hi.
And we're here to talk about being libertarians working in the mental health field. I actually approached her about this some time ago. This is actually the first time we've met, so forgive us if this doesn't go smoothly. But this came up. She's also known as Liberty Doll on Facebook for any of you who may have stumbled across that page. And this idea first started kicking around in my head because she made a comment about caring or about being a therapist,
Yes.
Which got my attention because libertarians and mental health don't seem to be all that common. That up until, I'm a psychiatrist, up until recently I was working on an acute inpatient psychiatric unit, and one of the social workers would periodically make some complaint about Medicaid or state regulations, and I would be, aha, and jump in there, and they'd blow me off with, oh, there goes Jim on his libertarian rant again, and he'll probably do it again tomorrow too, and they were right. And so she mentioned, being a libertarian, a therapist, and a gun owner, and it's like, oh, look at this, because, guns are also not...
it's an awkward predicament.
Yeah. But at the same time, and so this is why we kind of picked the title for the talk that we did, we're not entirely welcome with open arms in the libertarian community at times either. That, we've been called outright evil at times. Heartless. Did you know that psychiatry in the Soviet Union was used to, detain, dissidents and brainwash them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It's like, yes, I was not there. Don't use collectivist thinking, if we're going to criticize others for it. And it's created some weird situations where I've been, somewhat praised for things that I really kind of felt dirty about. The judge in the county that we call in when we're going to keep somebody involuntarily admitted for a period of time greater than 3 days said that he knew I was libertarian, and so if he got a request from me to have somebody involuntarily admitted for a longer period of time, he actually took that seriously. And like, thanks? Which my partner would do it when she feared a lawsuit, which just nauseated me. But we definitely do some things that go against the non-aggression principle at times, and sometimes I think there are more valid reasons, sometimes there are less valid reasons, but it's part of the system we're in. Right. That people are admitted against their will at times, people have medications given against their will at times, people have guardians established. It's like, all right, you have been determined by a judge to not be able to make your own decisions regarding your own body and or your own finances, and so someone is being picked to make those decisions for you, and you are now functionally legally a child. You can't consent to your own procedures. Have your rights basically stripped from you. Child Protective Services, neither one of us work for, but definitely have an overlap with the mental health industry. Then you've had some experience with court-ordered counseling.
Yes, I actually, at this point, about 75% of the clients that I see in my nonprofit community mental health organization are actually through the probation and parole departments. And even if they are not determined to really have any mental illness, substance abuse problems, anything like that, they are court-ordered to come to treatment and see me every single week. And a lot of them really don't like that. Some of them just come in because they think I'm cute, but for the most part, they really are not happy about having to be in therapy. So unfortunately, as a libertarian in the mental health field, we kind of become a cog in this machinery of the state. There's all of the issues that Jim just mentioned, but there's also the issue of where we are mandated reporters. So what that means is if someone comes in and they are presenting an imminent risk of wanting to harm themselves or harm someone else, or if they come in reporting any sort of child abuse, that means that we have to file a report and call some sort of authority. Specifically, there is the Tarasoff law. It is considered the duty to warn, where there is imminent risk, where someone is going to go and harm or kill someone else. And this law first came into effect in 1976 when the Supreme Court ruled on a case of a young woman named Tatiana Tarasoff there was a young man who was obsessed with her and was going to psychiatric treatment, and he told his psychologist several times that he had plans to stalk this woman and hurt her or kill her, and the psychologist didn't do anything about it. He didn't tell anyone, and eventually, after a few years, this young man did in fact go and kill this woman. So the Supreme Court ruled after that in 1976 that all mental health workers do have a duty to warn, where if they become knowledgeable of any sort of threat against someone else, that they do have to do something about it. So what that means is if you are in a duty to warn situation, you have to get all the information you can about the potential victim, you have to warn them that someone is coming to hurt them, and then you have to take additional steps such as calling the police. And the police then are supposed to go and protect this person, even though they don't have any duty to protect people, as we have learned.
We do, strangely enough, but the employees of the state don't.
No, they do not. So all states have this duty to warn law except for Maine, North Dakota, Nevada, and North Carolina. And after the police show up and talk to this person who is a potential victim, then they have to go and find the aggressor. Usually they run around in squad cars with their lights blazing. They find this person, they handcuff them, and they bring them to an emergency room to get evaluated, where they are either then committed against their will or set free. The problem is, with this as well, is that you don't always find out if this person was successfully found. Sometimes this person who is the aggressor might even make a threat against their therapist or their psychiatrist and then run away, and then you're not really sure what happens to them. You don't ever really hear about that. There's also the danger to self that has to be reported. That's when someone is in imminent risk of killing themselves. Sometimes you can talk them down, you can get them to make a safety plan, you can get them to contract for safety until their next appointment, but it doesn't always happen. So then you have to find a psychiatrist somewhere in the building, unless you are a psychiatrist, and then you have to fill out a nice, in my agency, pink piece of paperwork where you have to talk about the person's illness, who they are, where they live, the threats that they have made. And then again, it's the police that show up and find this person and bring them to an emergency room. Now, once they've gone to the emergency room, if it's decided that they need to go to a hospital for whatever reason, it is an ambulance that takes over. But in most cases, it is the police that will be going and knocking down your door if you've made a threat to someone or to yourself.
And can I? And the police often resent this work and don't do a good job of it. That we had somebody once who I called police for because this guy was imminently dangerous, which didn't take any sort of mental health provider to recognize that just anybody looking at this guy, he was keyed up, he was going to end up hurting somebody in the very near future. The police asked me, had he hurt anybody yet? And it's like, no, not yet. And like, all right, so it became an immediate low priority. And then when the police were there, the police officer in particular was, ranting in our waiting room about this not being police work. I once, a patient of mine, his wife called me that he had schizophrenia, was fairly high functioning, but hadn't been taking his medications, had become progressively more agitated. One of their children did something and he smacked her across the face once. Was horrified by what he did. This was not something he typically did. He then went and took a whole bunch of his medication and went to lie down. So I filled out one of the papers, which are pink where we are too. I don't think it's a legal requirement, but it certainly seems very common. So I filled out one of these papers. In the state of Ohio, there's, the pink piece of paper has 4 check boxes. I need to check off at least one of those. One of those says that I think you're going to, basically kill yourself. One of them says I think you're going to kill somebody else due to mental illness. A third one says because of your mental illness, you're not able to take care of yourself, so you're not going to kill yourself.
I think we have the same paper.
But you haven't been eating, and you've been sleeping outside in the snow, and are losing fingers and toes because you don't know well enough to come out of the cold. Or there's a fourth one, I think Ohio is one of the few states that has this, that because of your mental illness, you are violating the rights of others or yourself. So if you're manic and all of a sudden you're spending your entire life savings trying to build a warp drive in your basement, all right, theoretically you have a right to your own money that you're now blowing on ridiculous crap. That's a very soft call and isn't used very often. But regardless, this guy had just taken an uncertain amount of medication, had just hurt his kid. I called the police, filled out the form, faxed it to him. They had no idea what this thing was. They went to his home, saw him, decided he looked okay to them, and so arrested him and took him to jail, you know, for having hit his kid. He just took an uncertain amount of medication. You know, it's like, I didn't want the guy to get sick and have something bad happen, but I kind of did, because I wanted to, you know, it's like, you are not doctors. You know, when do you evaluate overdoses? But they decided, you know, it's like, well, he hit his kid. We're just going to take him to jail. You know, he was released afterwards, but yeah, they don't mesh with the mental health system well. Some of them actively resent it, and there's ironically another talk going on about mental health first aid right now. Some of that. But yeah, so even when the system has things laid out about how this is supposed to work, it doesn't work the way it should.
No, it does not. So the third kind of mandated reporting that we also have to do is when there's cases of child abuse and neglect, which consists of physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, but it can also include witness to domestic violence. And this raises a question of what is abuse and neglect. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, different agencies and clinics have different policies about this. But a lot of them tend to build their policies around issues of liability rather than actually wanting to help people. For example, I worked at one agency where I was actually doing therapy in people's homes. So I would be driving around neighborhoods and I'd be going to people's houses, and sometimes I would walk in and, you know, the parents would be fighting and there's a little kid, and if the little kid is anywhere in the apartment or the house while their parents are fighting, then by my company policy, I had to call. In Massachusetts, it's the Department of Children and Families. In other states, it's Department of Child Protective Services. But if I saw a kid anywhere in a house where parents were fighting, I had to go and call some agency to have them swoop in to try to save this child. I did not like that at all, and that was actually one of the reasons why I left that agency. But at my current agency, they have a much more low-key policy where we have to actually witness something really terrible happening before we actually have to go and call in some government agency to try to, you know, do whatever with these children. Now, the laws also vary by state, but 48 states have laws that require all mental health workers to report incidences of child abuse and neglect, and all states actually also have penalties for not reporting. In Florida, Arizona, and Minnesota, if you witness something that can be qualified as child abuse and you do not report it, you are charged with a felony. In Illinois and Kentucky, your second offense is also a felony. So you could be given jail anywhere from 30 days to 5 years for not picking up the phone if your agency has some policy where children see their parents fighting and you don't call. So you could go to jail. You could also have a fine anywhere from $300 to $10,000. And in 7 states, if you don't call, you're held liable for any damages that the state thinks may or may not have happened. But despite all of this horrible bureaucracy that we're subject to, there are some good things that we're able to do as libertarians in mental health. For example, if clients come in and they talk about owning firearms, we're not going to panic, even though technically the field considers owning firearms or any sort of weapons a risk. As a matter of fact, in Massachusetts, they have a standard documentation project, and they just revised the risk assessment, and now on intake, when someone comes in for their first session, if they tell us that they own firearms, we have to report it on our risk assessment as a problem behavior. Another problem is if someone has been institutionalized or forced to go to a hospital for any reason, they are federally not allowed to own firearms. In some cases, people can petition to get a letter from a therapist or psychiatrist saying that they're actually in perfect health and have every right to own a firearm, but the reality is that most therapists, agencies, and psychiatrists will not fill out any of these letters because, again, it's a liability issue. If they sign that someone is perfectly able to go handle a firearm and then this person shoots someone else, they get in trouble, but whoever wrote the letter gets in trouble too. And also, many of the mentally ill live in poor areas because of the nature of their illnesses. So they're subject to being in more high crime areas, and they're more likely to become victims. So as a libertarian, if someone comes into my office and tells me that they own a firearm, I perfectly understand. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to freak out. I'm going to try not to report it as long as my boss doesn't find out. But unfortunately, too, what comes up also is that many of the resources that we might refer people to are unfortunately state or government run. People who need housing or need meds or treatment, hospitalization, case management services, anything like that, unfortunately is mostly provided through the state. There's not very many private or charitable agencies that will provide those services right now. So unfortunately, sometimes we do facilitate people becoming dependent on the state. But I mean, there's not really a lot of options out there right now. But also, so some other good things along with the firearms issue is we can recognize people as individuals. We can respect their autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions, their own independence. When people come into my office looking for counseling, I always tell them that they are the only experts on themselves. No one else can tell them what they need, what they should do, and what they must do. I also don't catastrophize if someone comes in and they're telling me they have anti-government beliefs. I'm like, awesome, that's cool. I'm not allowed to tell them that I have those beliefs too, but I do go along with it, and I'm like, hey, so, you know, have you read any Larkin Rose? You know, how much do you know about economics? Let's talk about this. And actually, a surprising number of my clients come in actually have some sort of anti-government beliefs, or they don't want to pay taxes, or they distrust the government, or own firearms. Most other therapists, when they see my paperwork of some of my clients, they're like, wow, you know, that person is really psychotic. And I'm like, you know what? I don't really think that they are. I just think that they're independent people that are thinking for themselves, and, you know, who are you or I to tell them that that's wrong?
And so much of that is culturally or subculturally determined. You know, that there are coworkers of mine that if somebody was, you know, ranting about, you know, additives or preservatives in food, that this would be not unexpected, you know, and it's like, oh, this is that perfectly, you know, that makes absolute sense. They should be growing everything in their garden, which we may or may not agree with too. But then, you know, working in the VA with psychotic people was especially challenging. And it's like, all right, at what point, you know, it's like, all right, the, you know, the government put devices in my body. All right, probably not. The government injected me with syphilis. Shit. The government deliberately exposed me to radiation from atomic bombs in the Southwest. Yeah, okay. Some of these things happen. And so when, you know, it's like, I haven't heard of that one yet, but I don't... Maybe that one did.
What's really fun is when they come in complaining that the FBI is following them and no one believes them except for you, and then you find out, yes, the FBI is indeed following them.
You know, when I was still in medical school, the Secret Service came in to talk to me, not me in particular, I was still a student, but I was working in the psychiatric ER at the hospital I was at, to talk to the attending psychiatrist there about somebody who had a lot of interest in Hillary Clinton. This was back in the late 90s, so but yeah, it's like, all right, here I am involved, you know, talking to the Secret Service. If this guy's paranoid, he's got, yeah, he should be. Yeah, there was somebody we had once who was convinced he was in the FBI, and it's like, great, have your superior call us and you're out of here. You know, that's all we need to do, which he couldn't ever quite generate, you know, and this was one of the people that the judge ended up coming down to. And I told him, yeah, if he'd have told me the NSA was reading his emails, I'd have said, me too. I'd have discharged him and we'd gone out and had a beer after all this was over with. But that never quite came up, so. But yeah, I've had people where the family's freaked out because, well, he went and got his, you know, CCW permit. I'm like, and what's he actually, you know, it's like, where is, you know, depending on what your familiarity and comfort level with guns is, I can understand why that seems unusual, but has he said he's going to do it to get somebody? You know, which most of those people don't. I'm going to go get a CCW permit so I can go out and shoot somebody. No, it's, if you're planning on just going out and shoot somebody, you just put it in your pocket and go shoot them, you know, 90% of the time, I figure. But, you know, it's like, where is the actual threat? I had a guy once who got into a big fight with his wife. and said, I need to get my gun, went and got his gun and stormed off, and it was like, and then she called police, and it was like, all right, and he was brought to the hospital for observation, and he's like, that was stupid, and it's like, yes, it was. We released him after like only a night or two, but yeah, I had to tell him because he was an IDPA shooter. You know, I asked him what kind of gun was it when he was like a 45. I'm like, okay, what kind of gun was it? Was it 1911? And all of a sudden he's like, oh, yeah, okay. He wasn't expecting me to know anything, but he was an IDPA shooter, and I had to tell him, it's like, go talk to a lawyer, because you know, the way the language is, and you know, who can still have firearms, who still can't, you know, it's like if you've been, you know, involuntarily admitted to a mental institution for anything other than observation, it says, and observation, I don't know how well defined that is. You know, it's like, according to an insurance company, you know, someone is observation if I keep them in less than 48 hours, during which time you're still considered outpatient, even if you're locked into a ward, you're quote unquote outpatient. But I'm not sure if that's the definition the you know, the government uses when deciding who can still have or cannot have firearms. And yeah, you were making reference before, every once in a while someone's like, well, we should have psychological screening for people to have firearms. That just terrifies me to no end, because again, many people in our field are not firearm friendly.
No.
And you know, it's like, they're just going to see, it's like, well, if you want firearms, you're clearly, you know, not psychologically appropriate to have them. Like that's, I don't think is an exaggeration at all when people say that that's going to happen. And yeah, the liability issues, that it's like, well, if I say this guy can have it and he goes and does something, then I'm going to be liable, which may not be an exaggeration. No. So that's a horrible screening method.
It is. But despite this, there's also even certain types of therapies that at least seem like they're tailored towards the individual. A lot of them do have an emphasis on personal autonomy and decision making. For example, there's a type of therapy, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's all about rational and logical thinking. It's goal-oriented, it's action-oriented, it's what you find in a lot of self-help books, and it's not only about being logical and rational, but also learning skills to get through whatever it is that you're going through. It has this viewpoint where everyone has different kinds of skills or tools in their toolbox, and it's just a matter of getting the right skill and the right tool, and it's things that anyone can learn and anyone can do if they put their mind to it. It's very adapted and tailored towards individuals, so you're not going to be doing the same thing with Fred that you are over here with George. It's very different. There's also a type of therapy called motivational interviewing that also adapts to individuals. And it's all about where they are in their life and how ready they are to make some sort of change or move on from whatever situation in their life. And it's about finding what works and motivates them. Not someone else, not some external factor, it's whatever works for them. It's also goal-oriented, and it's very non-judgmental. There's even a phrase within motivational interviewing techniques called roll with the resistance, and it's all about if someone comes to some step or thing that they don't want to do, you don't make them do it. You wait until they are ready to go in that direction, or they find some other way around it. There's zero direct persuasion, and the therapy is seen as a partnership rather than an expert with a patient or a client. And the client is the one that does all the work for the change.
And coercion is actively, like, is the antithesis of motivational interviewing. Like, people who have researched and developed this technique have, you know, examples of where, you know, if you try and coerce somebody, the behavior you're trying to, you know, theoretically and trying to encourage actually becomes less common, you know, that, I'm trying to think of people, they had an example of people who are, you know, like the early, you know, prisoner colonists in Australia, you know, would be whipped if they were, you know, drinking, and they had, you know, songs they would sing while drinking about this, you know, that they kept drinking. You know, it's like, don't tell me what to do is kind of, you know, what motivational interviewing expects from people. You know, if you try and tell somebody from a top-down level, you know, you're going to do this, it's for your own good, that they're going to move in the other direction. It's like, no, I'm not. And so it tries to, you know, doesn't try to, but it avoids that kind of thinking entirely. But really, it's like, all right, what do you want? What sort of outcomes do you want? And what do you think is going to get you there? And, you know, maybe guiding passively, or, you know, but not, you know, arm twisting or anything like that. So I think that kind of lends itself to our sort of thinking much better than some of the other traditional ways that analysis used to work. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's some more criticisms of, was this from the Libertarian side?
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, more criticism. I should have said this more at the beginning, but, yeah, some more criticisms that we've had from within the Libertarian community, that we're kind of the maintainers of the status quo, that anything that deviates from the culture or the norm is defined as mental illness, and so therefore is our job to clamp down on, which to say that that doesn't happen at all, I wouldn't say that. That definitely happens to some degree, but I don't think is really the core of what our job is. Then there's been accusations, not just from the Libertarian community, but from others out in the world that mental illness doesn't really exist. That it's all just socially deviant behavior, or someone just needs to pull themselves up from the bootstraps. Thomas Zaz, I don't know who's familiar with him, but was a psychiatrist and wrote a lot of this, that mental illness, there's no such thing. It's just socially deviant behavior, and the culture defines that behavior as mental illness, which again I'm not going to say is entirely incorrect. The new diagnosis or list of diagnoses for mental illness just came out recently, the DSM-5, and has basically like the cookbook of ingredients that if somebody has X, Y, and Z, then they have this diagnosis. It includes things like internet addiction and oppositional defiant disorder. Is often brought up by libertarians that it's like, oh, if I don't like doing what authorities tell me to, then they're going to diagnose me with this. Some of those I think are misunderstood. Some of those, yeah, it's just like, all right, that there are such things as people who, from my perspective, aren't mentally ill, but engage in habitual maladaptive behaviors or socially deviant behaviors, and that's fine, as from my perspective. If they are bothered by it enough to want help with it, then I think them seeing a mental health professional is perfectly appropriate. But then, and I'm skipping all over the place, but then there becomes the problem that if someone's going to see one of us and be paid, and then we're going to be paid for our services, we actually need to diagnose them with a disorder out of this book. If we just say that we're helping counsel them with some life difficulties in life, or people have used the term life coach, there's no reimbursement for that, which in a purely libertarian society may be fine, because maybe they'd be paying out of pocket or whatever. But in the society we live in, no, we need to say they have X disorder in order for that to be a reimbursable service, which we don't like having to do, but that's the reality of it. And they now have some sort of stamp on their medical record about a disorder they have, quote unquote. So.
But so again, one of the criticisms that often comes up of mental health, especially in the liberty movement, is that mental illness isn't real. It can't be measured. It can't be seen. It can't really be diagnosed. There's no gene. There's no lab test that you can do. But the reality is there's actually a lot of mental illnesses that do have physical evidence in the brain that they have found through different neuroimaging techniques. For example, people with schizophrenia actually have less brain tissue than people who don't have schizophrenia. There's less density, there's less volume, their brains are physically smaller, and there's actually these hollow spaces that everyone has inside their brains that's full of fluid. They're called ventricles. These are actually also larger in people with schizophrenia, and their brains look almost exactly the same as the brains of people who have organic dementias. There's also, everyone's heard of ADHD, and while that is a very pop diagnosis that I think is completely overdiagnosed, there is evidence that has been found that people that do truly have this or exhibit these behaviors actually have a smaller frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe of your brain is actually what's responsible for planning and impulse control and decision making. And they also have lower brain volume. And of course, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, which everyone has heard of. And that also shows physical changes in the brain. When you are exposed to this horrible trauma, whether it's happened to you or you're witnessing it happening to someone else, there's physical changes in your brain. The area of your brain that's responsible for learning, for making memories, for dealing with stress, actually starts to become smaller. This area of the brain is called the hippocampus, and it naturally kind of regenerates itself. But when you're exposed to some really horrible trauma and you start just, freaking out about it and you can't get over it, this part of your brain actually does stop regenerating itself. It basically stops working. You start losing brain cells in that area of your brain. And you start producing stress hormones that just don't go away, and they stay elevated. And this is why sometimes, if anyone knows someone with PTSD, they might be jumpy or moody or angry. It's because of the changes that are happening in their brain and the chemicals that their body just keeps spewing out that won't go away. And they also have changes, like people with ADHD, in their frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, which also regulates people's mood and their fear response. So there's different levels of problems that people might come in to a counseling or psychiatrist office to deal with, and it could be anything from life coaching to, severe mental illness. It could be that maybe their mom just died and they're really upset about it. Maybe they're going through a divorce, or, maybe they're seeing and hearing things and it really disturbs them. But like Jim said, we need to provide a diagnosis if we want to get reimbursed by insurance companies or even paid by our employers. And interestingly enough, the new DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it came out in May of 2013, and while all insurance companies require you to provide a diagnosis the very first time you meet someone, even if it's only for an hour, the new DSM has limitations on that, and you're actually not supposed to diagnose anyone until you've been seeing them for 6 months. However, a couple months ago, Congress decided they were going to get together and look at this criteria and decided that they were going to push back its rollout for another year. So even though we have these new standards that we're supposed to follow, where we don't diagnose people either at all or only after a long period of time, the insurance companies and Congress won't actually do that. They're still making us diagnose people on the very first time we see them after maybe even only 45 minutes or an hour.
Congress knows better, I'm sure. They're all looking out for us.
And the next meds.
Okay, yeah, no, actually, that's a good launch off. That I was going to talk about medications, which is another really unpopular thing among some libertarians when mental health starts coming up. Is that she said this was a really good point. I emailed this to her a while ago. That I'm being told sometimes that I'm poisoning people's minds and wrecking their lives and altering their brain chemistry by people that think that heroin and cocaine should be available in schools and vending machines as long as they're privately owned. That just seems odd to me. Now, are medications misused sometimes? Oh, yes, absolutely. It's for any number of reasons. There are definitely doctors out there that you come in and tell them that you broke up with your girlfriend and you've been crying about it, that they'll write you a prescription for Prozac on the spot, which is not at all appropriate. But is it conceivable that no people anywhere, are ever benefiting from these medications or, actually voluntarily want them because they've seen improvements in their life and their emotional state? Yeah, that's happened. Do some people, not want to be medicated, and that's fine too? Absolutely, depending on the situation. Very, very few people, I think, really warrant medication enough to keep them, that they should be given them against their will. Which I want to kind of bring up again towards the end when we talk about how mental health might work in a voluntary society. But talking about, actual, physical changes in people, PTSD is a great example. That the one medication that I've seen near a 100% success rate is something called prazosin, which actually has been a blood pressure and blood pressure and prostate medication for a good long time. It's generic. I own no stock in any medication, pharmacologic company, anything like that. But this medication works for blood pressure by basically blocking the receptors in your body for adrenaline, because we've all got some level of adrenaline in our system all the time. And when we start talking about how medications work in mental health, it all becomes very, very theoretical, because the brain is just incredibly complex, and our understanding of it is still very, very primitive. But what I tell patients with PTSD with recurring nightmares is that, people with PTSD, your adrenaline is kind of stuck in overdrive. Your body is kind of stuck in this fight or flight method, or level all the time. And you're sleeping, and your brain, it's like, all right, you've got all this adrenaline on board. Something scary must be happening. All right, turn on the scary movie, and then you have a nightmare. We block the receptors for that, and it stops. It's not always with the first dose, but within a night or two, I've had people who have had nightmares for years all of a sudden stop having nightmares, and they're getting good sleep for the first time in a long, long time. It's if there was no, biologic reason for any of these mental illnesses, then the biologic interventions I don't think would really be working. Okay.
So if we want to think about how any of this would work in a completely voluntary or libertarian society, first we have to understand a little bit about how it currently works now in our state society. So first off, there's the issue again of diagnosis and the criteria that is required to give people a diagnosis. Now, it's the American Psychiatric Association that decides what is and is not a mental illness and what kind of behaviors or things you have to exhibit to be qualified for having a mental illness. Some of these are more scientific than others. Homosexuality used to be in there as a diagnosis. There was also one about runaway slaves. So if you were a slave and you ran away, you were considered to be mentally ill. These are no longer in the DSM because of science or councils that came together and had a vote over it. But many of the experts in the APA that decide what is and is not a diagnosis also receive a large amount of money from the government and from big pharmaceutical companies. Most notably, Pfizer and Eli Lilly are very guilty of this. They've actually begun a transparency project a few years ago where they actually publicize the lists of all the people that they have donated to or paid. And if you look at the lists that Eli Lilly and Pfizer provide, they are pretty much exactly the same as the lists of panels on the DSM. So many therapists don't like giving diagnoses. We don't really believe in a lot of the criteria. It's very difficult to place someone into a box, and no one ever really fits in these boxes. But unfortunately, it does make it a little bit easier to talk to other providers, primary care doctors, case managers. But when we do this diagnosing and do this treatment, we also have to remember that the researchers who are doing the research for the FDA and these different medications are also receiving big money from the government and from the pharmaceutical companies. I think we can all assume that if someone says, hey, do research on my medication, I'll give you $100,000, that you're probably going to make sure that there's positive results. And there's also the question of the labelings and the warnings that the FDA puts on these medications and the complete lack of logic that the FDA sometimes has. And it's the question of, what is a drug? What is considered a drug? Is it Cheerios? Is it heroin? Is it this blood pressure medication?
Cheerios was smacked down by the FDA for printing on their box that eating Cheerios lowers cholesterol. This was a scientifically verifiable fact. It's like, all right, that the fiber in Cheerios absorbs some of the cholesterol and, then expels it. But by saying that, the FDA said that they were, saying that their products treated a medical condition and therefore, needed to be labeled as a drug. Yeah. Meanwhile, it's all very weird semantic stuff that the FDA does. If you say, improves liver function, on your homeopathic, bottle of snake oil, that's fine. But you mention a condition, it's oxygen helps treat hypoxia. Well, that's a drug now. Which bottled oxygen really is. Maybe that's a bad example. Water. Therefore, this water. This treats dehydration. By the FDA's rules, they could say that needs to be, labeled as a drug now. There are more politicians and lawyers, I'm convinced, in the FDA than there are physicians or scientists, and it really shows. There was recently a study came out saying that since around 2002, 2003-ish, when the FDA put a black box warning on all antidepressants about increased suicidal thinking or behavior, especially in adolescents or young adults, that since then the rate of overdosing or suicidal behavior in that population has actually gone up while prescriptions have gone down, which I'm not going to say is a one-to-one correlation, but the FDA is saying, well, we never meant for people to stop prescribing this stuff. We just meant, the depression is really serious and they should keep a close eye on this because people with depression kill themselves, which is not what the warning says at all. They're just, that's all PR because it says, children and adolescents, may try and kill themselves more often, more or less. And they don't have warnings on any other medicine about what is bad about the condition. They don't have, on nitroglycerin or aspirin, it's like, watch these people because they might have a heart attack, because they're heart patients. That's why they're taking this stuff in the first place. They don't have that warning on there. Abilify was originally marketed as an antipsychotic for schizophrenia, and then later got an indication as an add-on to other antidepressants for people who are on an antidepressant already, are partially better but not all the way better, to use this medication to get them the rest of the way better. And just by getting that indication from the FDA put that black box warning on it. There was no science there. There was no nothing. It's just that any medication used to treat condition X has, warning Y on it, just because it's used for condition X. Another good example of that are medications for sleep, so like Ambien, Lunesta, which are all cousins of things like Valium, Xanax, or Ativan. All have a warning about sleepwalking or other, sleep behaviors that people get up and do things that they then have no recollection of. Rosarum is another medication for sleep, which is in no way related to those. Rosarum is more closely related to melatonin, which is a natural product that lots and lots of people take to help them sleep. But because it is used for insomnia, it has this warning on it. It's like there's no rational reason to think that this has anything in common with it. Might it warrant watching it to see if it does? Sure, but the FDA is not about, watching and, finding things out. It's about, well, let's put warnings on things so that all the risk is on the physician's part, more or less. It's like, let's put them at risk and cover our own butts, and so they do.
So another element in today's state of the mental health community is deinstitutionalization. And what that was, on October 31st in 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, which seemed like it would be really awesome because it would close a bunch of hospitals that were overcrowded, where they were abusing patients, where they were understaffed, where men who wanted to divorce their wives and didn't want to go through legal proceedings could just send their wives off to. So it seemed really great that all these were going to be closed. And they were supposed to be replaced with community mental health centers, which would provide every service imaginable for anyone, from counseling to medications, day programs, classes, pretty much anything. But what actually happened is that only half of the centers were built, none of them were funded, and we lost 90% of the country's hospital beds. So what happened was all these people that had lived in these state hospitals for years and years and years were released with nowhere to go, no one to talk to, no skills, no housing, nothing. And if you look at any town that had one of these hospitals that was closed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to this day, they have a humongous homeless population. And it's because these people weren't given any services, weren't given any skills, anything that they could possibly do after they were let out from this hospital and just put on the streets. And now that there are less hospital beds, there's a lower availability of care. And now if someone comes in and they're saying, well, gee, I really don't feel good. I don't think things are going right. I'm afraid of what's going to happen. I want to spend a couple days in the hospital. We can't do that. We can't let them go. We usually have to wait for something bad to happen until they come in and have tried to hurt someone else or hurt themselves or say that they're going to do it. And then when these things do happen and they go to the crisis center or the emergency room, they could be sitting in the emergency room for a week in a bed in the hallway waiting for a hospital bed for them to go to. We've also seen a rise in the prison population after all these hospitals were closed down because it was, again, people that didn't have any skills, didn't really know how to live outside of a hospital setting or any institutionalized setting. And, maybe they commit crimes or, maybe they do something wrong because they want to go to a prison because they feel safer there. And then when people with mental illness do commit crimes, the system doesn't know how to deal with them. It doesn't have a place to treat them, so they send them to prison. And in prison, people get little to absolutely no care. Most of these places don't have counseling. Very few prisons even have AA meetings, anything. So they're just kind of stuck in this limbo. And then there's also a lot of people that are on Medicare, Medicaid, and other state insurances. In Massachusetts, we have something called Mass Health that was introduced in 2006. It was one of the first state-provided insurances and is absolutely free and requires us to provide free services to people that have it. But even though we are giving free treatment, it doesn't authorize people to actually have treatment. Most of these people are only allowed to have counseling and can't receive any other treatment. So what happens is a lot of counseling and med management and not much else.
Then more on what might happen, in a theoretical voluntary society, which is, speculative at best. It's like, who will build the roads? The whole medical system is going to be turned upside down, because if people, the FDA is no longer going to exist, so medications will be more, open source and available over the counter. Will I think there still be a profession of people that can be consulted about which medication might be right for me? Yeah, I think that'll absolutely exist. But the gatekeeper function of you need this medication, but you need to come and see me to get it will no longer exist. What will happen with some of the lower functioning like schizophrenics who just plain can't take care of themselves, or who while they're on their medications are able to function in society reasonably well, but if they go off their medication are living under a bridge, losing their fingers and toes to frostbite. And this is one situation where, and I'm kind of bracing myself for backlash on this one, where I think well, first of all, let me just say, I don't think in any voluntary society that it'll be universally accepted that no one, violates the non-aggression principle, or that there won't be people whose profession involves violating the non-aggression principle. Those are going to exist. But say I have a son with schizophrenia, I know he does well on medication, but he doesn't always take it and ends up disappearing for periods of time, and has gotten very, very sick. I might employ, a DRO, if I'm going to rip off Stefan Molyneux, to go and forcibly administer his medication once a month. If he's high enough functioning to get his own DRO to counter that, then he's high enough functioning to counter that, and that might not happen. But it's like this is a model that actually exists in other countries, and I'm morally ambivalent about it, and I'm sure it's been misused, but I've had people who have went to medical school in India and come over here, and it's like, oh yeah, the public health people there, they just go to the village, they know where what's his name is, and they go and chase him down and tackle him in the street and give him a shot, and then say we'll see you again next month, and then go on their merry way. Is there a role for that? It's like, I don't like how that sounds, but it's like if I'm employing a private agency to give my kid, he's not really schizophrenic, he's right back there. He's kind of got the little schizophrenic disheveled beard thing going, actually, but
that's not nice.
It's like, that's one of the criteria. Yeah, no, it's not. But dispute resolution organization. But basically the theoretical private security / insurance agencies that may exist and replace a large number of functions of the state at this point. That if I think someone in my family is subject to that sort of thing, I may very well find a organization or to contract with them. It's like, make sure my kid gets his medicine, because if he doesn't, bad things happen. Is that a violation of the NAP? Yeah, it is. Is there a role for that? I think there very well may be. And again, I think there would be some sort of self-organizing aspect of this, that if people may want to hire these organizations because I know my kid has schizophrenia, but people with schizophrenia, may not have anything to do with the next person with schizophrenia. The variation is so incredible, and it's not one illness. It's like we use this one label for it, but it's a cluster of illnesses with some features in common. But, you know, one person with schizophrenia may hear voices and suspect that something bad is going on, and the voices are telling him, it's like, the CIA is bugging your food, don't eat that, don't eat that. And so he may not eat something, but he may eat something else, and he may hold down a job and be married and be okay. If I'm his dad and try and order, you know, hire a company and go and give him his medication, that guy is organized enough to counteract that. You know, that he can hire his counter organization or what have you, that versus the person that's like, not able to organize their lives enough to come inside out of the cold. I'm sorry to keep using that example, but that's a concrete one that I know and have met a handful of people like that. They're not going to be able to plan and organize, you know, and so the people who are able to state their rights, you know, act on their rights, you know, and enforce their own rights, I think are not going to have their rights violated in this way, whereas people who are not, you know, it's almost a Darwinian sort of thing, that if you can't, you know, prevent yourself from being given medications once a month against your will, then you're going to get them. Which, sorry, but this is all very hypothetical again. You know, I don't know what would happen in a voluntary society. You know, it's like, so.
And there is a lot of evidence that charity care would work. I can't speak to other areas that might have other charities and things, but where I work in on the south coast of Massachusetts, there's a ton of charities that I refer people to all the time. There's Catholic Social Services. They give people free housing and apartments and teach them how to budget and manage their finances for 2 years at a time. There's homeless shelters, there's soup kitchens, there's this neat little one where you're given a colored card and you go once a month to their little store at the soup kitchen and you can get all the groceries you want on that day. There's an organization called Citizens for Citizens, which is a private nonprofit organization that pays people's electric and heating bills and helps them prepare their taxes, even though we don't agree with taxes, and different things like that. And, you know, there's organizations that will help people get a job or teach them how to build a resume or get through an interview. I mean, there are services out there now that are charities that if we didn't have a state system that could take over, and there might be more charities with other goals and other interests, and they would all compete, and it would be wonderful.
I think a lot of resources will be freed up also. I mean, on one hand, you know, a lot of hospital beds are full and people have had to wait for exceedingly long periods of time because the beds are full of only the sickest of the sick. They're also full of people who I'm 95% sure are full of shit and don't really need to be there.
They just don't want to be in the cold.
Right.
That's all it is.
Or they're looking to get, oh, nothing works for me except for Valium, doc. Oh, we're almost out of time. But you know, in the current climate, I'm liable if I discharge this person and they do something, you know, and so people have been discharged and showed up the next day, you know, having cut their wrists up to slices, which I don't think that would happen in a voluntary society. I don't think people are going to say, you're liable for what this person does after they leave here. That's very, you know, counter-libertarian thinking. And so I think being able to kind of weed out the people that I think are scamming the system, but can't prove it, you know, everything is very subjective when dealing with mental health. I can then say, you know, you're free to go, and if they hurt themselves, that's their right too. You know, they know what they're doing. But all right, so we're out of time. So
I guess that's it.
Yeah, so you don't get to ask any questions.